There's nothing quite as frustrating as ordering food, looking forward to that first bite, and then realizing it's a total letdown. Well, actually there is. Starting a new series and realizing halfway through, or worse, at the end, that it wasn't nearly as good as you expected. Sometimes the letdown hits early, sometimes it only comes when the story falls apart at the finish line. Either way, the feeling is the same, like you've wasted hours of your life on something that just didn't deliver. So in this video, we're looking at 12 shows that let us down in one way or another. 12th, Westworld. Westworld looked like HBO's next big triumph with smart writing, a heavyweight cast, and a universe blending sci-fi with philosophical depth. But from the second season on, the show became a prisoner of its own complexity. It felt like the writers were more concerned with looking clever than with telling a compelling story. Characters lost consistency, story arcs vanished, and the plot began chasing its own tail. What started as a meditation on consciousness turned into a tangled mess of theories that no longer moved anyone. It lacked soul and drowned in its own pretentiousness. 11th, 13 Reasons Why. The first season had real impact, tackling heavy themes with some degree of care, even amid controversy, but everything that followed felt like pure opportunism. The sequel stretched a story that had already been concluded, forcing new plotlines with no real justification. With each season, the writers seemed desperate to invent a new trauma, a new tragedy, without any regard for coherence or responsibility. The show became a parody of itself, where drama turned into spectacle, and the original message was completely lost. 10th, Weeds. Weeds began with a sharp, satirical idea: a suburban mom selling weed to support her family. The early seasons struck a great balance between biting humor and relevant social commentary, but the formula wore thin fast. The show kept repeating the same cycle. Nancy gets into a bigger mess and somehow slips out. The protagonist, once charming despite her moral ambiguity, grew increasingly insufferable. The show lost the timing of its own joke and in the end became yet another victim of its own success, stretched out until it no longer had a purpose. 9 Suits. Suits started with a clear premise and characters that clicked, a slick legal drama filled with sharp dialogue and compelling cases. But like many formula-driven shows, it eventually hit the wall of creative fatigue, the same trap that drained the energy from series like House, Grey's Anatomy, The Good Doctor, and The Blacklist. The writing began to lose its edge. Conflicts started repeating themselves, and what used to be dilemmas with real consequences and mounting tension slowly turned into quickly resolved situations with predictably positive outcomes. Speaking of consequences, the show often lost its sense of proportion by showing lawyers risking everything for side cases or to fix minor problems. And it wasn't just the small stories, this applied to major plot lines too. There were so many acts of self-sacrifice, like Mike going to prison, Harvey and Jessica admitting they knew about the fraud, and senior partners giving up their shares, that it became clear the writers were trying to add weight to the story, but the speed and convenience with which everything was resolved revealed that these were just shortcuts to keep things neat and uncontroversial, sailing to the easy resolutions. To make matters worse, the departure of key characters like Mike and Rachel broke the chemistry that had held the story together. The new cast worked for a while, but never reached the same level of engagement. In the end, it felt like the show kept going more out of habit than because it still had something relevant to say. Osme, Dexter. This is the only case in the list where I bailed early, so the criticism here comes from a close friend who watched the entire thing. According to him, the frustration was massive. Dexter started with one of the most intriguing premises on television: a forensic blood spatter analyst who leads a double life as a vigilante serial killer, guided by a strict moral code instilled by his adoptive father. The early seasons struck a rare balance between psychological depth, suspense, and dark humor. It was a bold character study wrapped in a crime procedural shell, and for a while, it worked brilliantly. But as the series dragged on, that delicate balance unraveled. The writing began recycling old themes, new villains felt like watered-down versions of past antagonists, and the moral dilemmas that once felt layered and compelling turned into melodramatic plot devices. Dexter's internal struggle, once the emotional core of the show, became muddled by increasingly erratic decisions that betrayed the character's original complexity. The ultimate collapse, however, came with the finale. In what felt like a tone-deaf attempt to subvert expectations, Dexter abandons his son, a character who was supposedly his last tether to humanity, fakes his death, and reappears as a lumberjack in the middle of nowhere. It was a jarring, incoherent ending that stripped the story of any meaningful resolution. Rather than offering closure or sparking thoughtful debate, it left audiences baffled and disappointed. For a show that once asked provocative questions about morality, justice, and identity, ending on such a disconnected and emotionless note felt not just unsatisfying but almost disrespectful. It wasn't just a bad ending, it was the kind that retroactively taints everything that came before it. 7th House. Much like what we said about Suits, these Case of the Week series eventually run out of real-life medical scenarios to draw from, and the writer's creativity starts to wear thin. One interesting shift in House is how the focus gradually moves from the medical mysteries to the personal lives of the characters. It doesn't hurt the show, in fact, as time goes on, we naturally want to know more about the people behind the lab coats, but it does highlight how the original format starts to show signs of exhaustion. Speaking of characters, most of them are interesting, layered, and have distinct personalities, but the undeniable gravitational center of the show is House himself. He's the engine behind everything that happens, and that over time became a double-edged sword. Keeping a character like House completely static would eventually bore the audience, so the writers tried to show some growth here and there. Problem is, in doing so, they risked stripping away the very essence of the character. The best or worst example of this was his relationship with Cuddy, which ended up feeling more like a high school romance than something rooted in the show's tone or in House's established personality. It painted a version of him that didn't quite match the character we had been following all along. Since the series focuses on everyday life rather than a grand overarching plot, it relies heavily on conflict and new scenarios to stay engaging. For a long time, it succeeds, but eventually it starts to stumble, especially toward the end. The final stretch, particularly the last 3 episodes, leans on frustrating conveniences and questionable decisions. The ending might look satisfying on the surface, but underneath, it lacks logic, consistency, and emotional weight. Still, despite its flaws and the letdowns in the later seasons, House remains one of my all-time favorites. 6th, Prison Break. Prison Break should have never gone beyond its first season, or at most, the second. The original escape arc was tightly constructed, with compelling characters and a steady buildup of tension that worked, even if we started to recognize the show's pattern of manufacturing suspense without real consequences. Michael's intelligence was the heart of the series, and his elaborate plan was what kept everything in motion. But even that doesn't hold up so well on a rewatch. What once seemed clever starts to show cracks. Take a simple example. Many of Michael's tattoos, if not most, turned out to be completely unnecessary, included more for style than substance. After that initial arc, the show became a string of increasingly forced excuses just to keep the plot alive. Each new season discarded the previous premise and introduced a new over-the-top plan with shaky motivations. The goals kept shifting. Presidential elections, a family conspiracy involving Lincoln and Michael's father, the execution of everyone tied to the escape, a rescue mission in Sona, the Scylla data card saga, internal wars within the company, and on it went. None of it connected meaningfully to what came before. To make things worse, the series leaned heavily on every tired narrative cliche in the book. Plot conveniences to create and resolve conflict, twists with no logic, constant rewriting of past events, abandoned characters and subplots, and of course, the classic trope of pitting the main characters against each other just for the sake of drama. Not to mention that Sarah died and came back more times than anyone could reasonably keep track of. In the end, the show spiraled into a kind of poorly written fanfiction, where plot holes were patched with even bigger plot holes. What started as a tight, high-stakes thriller morphed into a chaotic mess desperately trying to justify its own existence. 5. The Walking Dead. The premise of The Walking Dead was strong from the start, a zombie apocalypse where the real danger wasn't the undead, but humanity itself. Early seasons delivered intense drama, moral complexity, and genuine unpredictability. No one felt safe, and that tension kept viewers hooked. But over time, the show lost its edge. Even the zombies stopped being scary, pushed to the background as the story leaned into repetitive monologues and endless cycles of generic villains like the Governor Negan and Alpha. Each new threat aimed to reignite the spark, but most arcs felt dragged out or recycled, relying more on shock than substance. Character development also stalled. Beloved characters were either written off carelessly or left to repeat the same emotional patterns. The group's dynamic, once rich and nuanced, became formulaic, bad decision, argument, split up, someone dies, repeat. The world stopped evolving, stuck in a loop of new communities facing familiar problems. The show's biggest flaw was its refusal to change. Instead of taking narrative risks or rethinking its structure, it clung to past successes, hoping that would be enough. But without urgency, growth, or meaningful stakes, the series became a chore. What began as a fresh take on the zombie genre ended as a slow, predictable cycle that even loyal fans abandoned. Not in anger, but in fatigue. 4. How I Met Your Mother. As much as I was never truly hooked by the story, I still expected at least a decent ending. After 9 seasons of build-up, what we got was a conclusion that completely disregarded the character's development. That said, the ending didn't bother me as much as it did most fans. The humor stayed strong throughout the seasons, but honestly, from my personal perspective, some of the jokes started to repeat themselves to the point of exhaustion. Yes, a lot remained funny and there were new gags along the way, but some bits wore thin over time. The characters themselves began to show signs of becoming caricatures of their former selves, which is common in sitcoms that go on for too long. The original premise, telling the story of how he met the mother of his children, was abandoned pretty early on, but no one really minded because the show was still enjoyable and, most importantly, funny. But when it comes to the actual plot, the show is already showing signs of fatigue even before the mother entered the picture, with questionable choices like Robin and Barney getting married. The worst part, though, came right at the end. They killed off the mother in a rushed, emotionless way, only to push the narrative back toward Robin, effectively undoing everything that had been built. It was a series of easy, rushed decisions that only satisfied those who had already stopped caring about consistency. A cold shower for anyone who followed the story, hoping for a thoughtful, well-earned resolution. Like I said, I wasn't too affected by the finale because, in a way, I had already sensed there wasn't much of a path left to follow. 3rd, Sons of Anarchy. Sons of Anarchy had everything it needed to become one of the great dramatic series on television. Morally complex conflicts, well-written characters, and a world soaked in constant simmering tension. And for a good stretch, it lived up to that potential. But the oversized seasons and the show's tendency to drag out conflicts for the sake of runtime eventually took their toll. Many storylines were unnecessarily stretched out due to convenient writing choices. While the plot usually stayed cohesive and events flowed logically, there were plenty of moments when simple, realistic resolutions could have avoided multi-season consequences. The series often manufactured drama by withholding common sense from its characters. That might pass once or twice, but across 7 seasons, it added up. The early atmosphere of the biker world was captivating. As the show progressed, the narrative shifted more toward personal conflicts, which wasn't inherently a problem. By that point, the audience was invested in that universe and naturally expected deeper exploration of character arcs. But what starts subtly becomes jarring by the end. The show created an imbalance in how it handled the struggles of its leads versus its secondary characters. Time and again, secondary characters were sidelined or sacrificed to elevate the emotional weight of much smaller issues faced by the protagonists. It created a dynamic where the world seemed to revolve around the main characters' egos rather than functioning as a living, breathing ecosystem. All of this chipped away at the show's consistency, but one moment broke it for me completely: Tara's death. The sequence of events that led to it felt so forced and contrived that it shattered the internal logic the series had spent years building. It wasn't just shocking, it was narratively hollow. Worse, the series was building toward a relatively grounded and satisfying conclusion, and this sudden detour sent everything spiraling into chaos. What followed felt less like the natural unraveling of a complex story and more like a clumsy, chaotic rush to maintain momentum. The final episodes tried hard to reclaim the sense of grandeur and tragedy the series once had, but by then, the emotional core had been too badly shaken. It still managed to stage an ending that looked epic, but the substance had already been lost. 2. Lost. Lost is perhaps the clearest example of what happens when a show becomes addicted to mystery without ever committing to real answers. It started as a compelling survival story with a sci-fi twist full of symbolism and just enough weirdness to keep audiences hooked. But instead of resolving its central questions, the show kept piling on new ones, building a web of intrigue that never paid off. The series thrived on ambiguity and fan speculation, leaning into confusion as a narrative tool. For a while, that worked. Viewers dissected every scene and clue, often finding meaning the writers hadn't actually planned. But over time, the cracks started to show. Major plot lines like the Numbers, the Dharma Initiative, or Walt's powers were either dropped or lazily explained. Characters came and went without closure, and the story became a tangled mess. Then came the finale, one of the most divisive in TV history. Rather than offer a satisfying sci-fi or metaphysical resolution, the show shifted to a vague, emotional afterlife subplot that ignored most of what had come before. The writers claimed it was always about the emotional journey, not the island or the mysteries, but that felt like a betrayal. The promise was meaning, what we got was a cop-out. Worse still, it became clear the writers had no master plan. They stretched the story too thin, stumbled through key reveals, and delivered an ending that clashed with the show's original tone. For fans who invested years in every clue, Lost didn't just disappoint, it insulted. A case study in ambition collapsing under its own weight. First, Game of Thrones. What was meant to be the greatest epic saga in television history ended up becoming one of the biggest disappointments in the history of entertainment. The decline began around season 5, when the show started to move beyond the source material. With that shift came a noticeable lack of creativity in continuing the story. Even though the writers seemingly had some notes or general direction on how the ending was supposed to unfold, the path toward that ending grew more incoherent with each passing episode, ultimately collapsing completely in the final stretch. Storylines were abruptly abandoned, character decisions felt rushed or completely unjustified, and the internal logic of the world began to fall apart. By the last 2 seasons, the situation deteriorated dramatically, events unfolded without meaning, key resolutions were forced or unearned, and the finale outright ignored the entire journey of its main characters. What was once a dense web of power struggles, shifting alliances, and meaningful developments where every character had distinct motivations and every arc stood on its own, was reduced to a simplistic throne dispute, with an accessory subplot involving ice zombies. The mystery of the White Walkers, carefully built up over years, was discarded in exchange for a single, poorly lit, tactically incoherent battle. The political intrigue that once defined the series was stripped away one arc at a time, replaced by oversimplified resolutions and the careless deaths of characters the writers clearly no longer knew how to handle. One of the show's greatest strengths, its commitment to consequences, often represented by the shocking but earned deaths of major characters, was gradually hollowed out. What once gave weight and meaning to the narrative was replaced by randomness and emotional detachment. By the end, the once intricate chain of cause and effect had been flattened into a single, rushed storyline, somehow managing the rare feat of being both overly simplified and disastrously executed. The ending wasn't just unsatisfying, it was almost insulting. A story that once captivated the world with its ambition, complexity, and bold storytelling choices finished as a hollow shell of itself, defined not by what it achieved, but by everything it failed to deliver. If you felt let down by any of these shows, or if there are others that left you with that "why did I waste my time" feeling, drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's hear your take, and maybe you'll find you're not alone in your frustration. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. There's still a lot more to critique, debate, and maybe even defend. See you in the next one!